It is said that the cemetery is where the dead speaks. Obviously, we all know that the dead literally doesn't speak to us when visiting the cemetery. It's when walking through a cemetery and gazing upon the messages on the tombstones and epitaphs, the loved ones visiting the deceased, the objects of sentimental value being left behind. It's like a place where you are being told several stories at once, the lives of so many people before reaching their final destination. Nothing really scary about the dead speaking and telling stories of their lives. But today's story, my friends, we are about to be introduced to an event that will give the dead a different form of communication. The situation that you are now seeing is a dispute between a father and a young man, both of them grieving over the loss of a loved one named Yuki. You see, the story that is being told right now is a tragic one, about a father named Numada, who had not only lost his wife, but had just lost his daughter Yuki, committed suicide. The young man you see visiting Yuki's grave is a lover, grieving over the loss of Yuki. His hopes of getting married and spending his life with Yuki are now gone, and seeing Numada's hostility towards the young man, blaming him for the death of his daughter, that none of this would have happened if he were to just leave Yuki alone. I think we all can get a general idea of what kind of story we are seeing right now, and how Yuki was driven into committing suicide. And just as the hostility died down between the father and his daughter's lover, giving Toshio a moment to grieve in peace, that was when Numada would return with the scarecrow he found nearby and plant it on Yuki's grave. A scarecrow to scare away unwelcoming varmints like Toshio, watching Yuki's grave being violated by a father's blind rage, a sign of disrespect, disappointment, and disgust. Just enough for Toshio to finally leave. When the cemetery gardeners noticed one of their scarecrows being planted on a grave, assuming that it must have been the kids nearby playing a cruel joke, things were about to take an interesting turn when they noticed something different with the scarecrow. At first, when they saw the scarecrow from the other side of the cemetery, it looked like one of their own. And when Numada casually apologized to the gardeners for taking one of the scarecrows because of an incident, well, there was a bit of confusion. When having a closer look at the scarecrow, the gardeners claimed that it can't be one of their own. The face on the scarecrow looked different, more human-like, with hair. In fact, if Numada didn't know better, the scarecrow's face strongly resembled his daughter. Something strange happening in the cemetery. For 4 days, Numada had been visiting Yuki's grave, watching the scarecrow slowly transform more into his daughter. At first, Numada tried finding a logical explanation behind this, assuming that it was somebody playing a trick on him. But the hair, the eyes, the lips, the likeness of the scarecrow's face having an uncanny resemblance of his daughter, and looking into the eyes of the scarecrow, those eyes looking down at her father, it was like Yuki's soul was inside the scarecrow. Just a few feet away is another story, a tragedy of a couple who had lost their son Shigeru. They said he died in a drowning accident when his body was found in the river. However, some people speculated that the boy was murdered. Shigeru wasn't the kind of boy who would be reckless and end up drowning by accident. It just didn't make sense. But with Shigeru's stepfather tending to his mother's feelings, trying to ease her grieving by telling her that she should focus on the fact that Shigeru wasn't murdered, that he died by accident. It was when they noticed a strange man carrying a scarecrow. Out of curiosity, the stepfather had to ask the old man what he was doing with the scarecrow, but didn't expect the answer. It wasn't a scarecrow, it was his daughter, Obviously, the couple was confused by the old man's response, a mixture of pity and concern with a man unable to move on from his daughter's death, that he would fantasize his daughter's soul being inside the scarecrow. It only took a few days before Numata's scarecrow would gain attention. The town talking about an old man who places a scarecrow on his daughter's grave. Somehow the scarecrow had a strong likeness to the deceased Yuki, outfitted in her clothing, and the old man visiting his daughter's grave tending to her needs. At first, he tried taking the scarecrow home, but when leaving the grave, the scarecrow would lose its resemblance of Yuki, thus becoming nothing more but a scarecrow. Even though people found it bizarre, there was also a fascination to this. The fact that the scarecrow was a spitting image of the old man's daughter. That even though the scarecrow never responded, people could see how the facial expressions and the eyes were showing signs of life. Imagine when a loved one has passed away, and you have the opportunity to ease the grieving torment by placing a scarecrow in front of that person's grave. Seeing the soul of the deceased transfer into a body of sticks and straws. At first, people would assume that something like this would be bizarre, a morbid way of desecrating a loved one's grave or possibly their souls. But knowing the hardship of losing a loved one, it wouldn't be surprising if people begin turning something like this into a tradition. And well, after noticing the old man placing a scarecrow in front of his daughter's grave and seeing the results of this act, that was when people began doing the same, and the dead began finding a unique way of telling their stories, or maybe finding a way to make sure that their story has a proper ending. And seeing the cemetery crowded with people, decorated with scarecrows being planted on the graves of the deceased, people talking to these scarecrows as if they were alive. Toshio didn't understand what was happening until he had overheard a few people explain the reasons for the scarecrows, that if you plant a scarecrow on the grave, in about 4 or 5 days, the scarecrow will begin to resemble the person that is buried on the grave. There was even talk about some of the scarecrows showing signs of life by moving their eyes and facial expressions. But when Toshio found Yuki's grave, finding her scarecrow as well, let's just say that when looking into the eyes of Yuki's scarecrow, it was like looking into the eyes of Yuki, instantly making Toshio a believer in these scarecrows. This scarecrow that resembled Yuki with the clothing and hair, it was a facial expression, the eyes that was looking down at her lover. Toshio was fully convinced that this scarecrow was in fact Yuki. He could even see the sadness, the pain of being deprived of a life and happiness. As for the mother who had lost her son in a drowning accident, the urge to reach out to Shigeru was overwhelming. Even though Shigeru's stepfather was strongly against the idea of planting a scarecrow on the grave, trying everything he can to help his wife overcome the tragic loss of her son, trying to explain how doing this would only make things worse. That this is not only creepy, but unnatural. Desecrating a grave of a loved one just to see a blank, hollow face. But for a mother losing a child, her own flesh and blood, of course her husband wouldn't understand. He isn't Shigeru's father. Calling this creepy when it's he who is the one that is acting creepy. As if there's a hidden reason why he doesn't want a scarecrow over Shigeru's grave. That night, Toshio had a dream. It was Yuki, alive and calling out to Toshio. When seeing the scarecrow, he knew that the whole time she was still alive, and embracing the moment of being reunited with Yuki, telling her that they should immediately get married, that he's willing to spend the rest of his life with her, regardless of what her father says. No matter what, he will never leave her. But when Yuki pointed at a scarecrow that was nearby, her scarecrow, That was when Toshio had suddenly woken up from the dream and had somehow found himself in the cemetery right near Yuki's grave, and seeing Yuki's scarecrow looking down at him, her eyes fixated on Toshio, the facial expressions that showed the promises he made within the dream. That was when Toshio began to panic. How did he end up at the cemetery? Is it possible that Yuki had brought him here? And when hearing the faint whispers, the scarecrows speaking, sharing their stories, their reasons for lingering onto this world, Toshio panicked and tried escaping the cemetery, running through a field of whispering scarecrows, those hollow faces fixated on him. The tragedy in their eyes, the anger, the hatred. This was definitely unnatural. The dead speaking. And Toshio began finding himself running through a sea of horror stories. And when Toshio had finally ran as far as he could from Yuki's grave, to the point where he was out of breath, it was when he looked up, only to find Yuki's scarecrow looking down at him. Toshio had made a vow, a promise, to spend his life with Yuki. It is said that language is 7% verbal. These scarecrows have not only captured the souls of the deceased, but had given them a different way to speak. You see, you may think that this is an example of people having a hard time from losing a loved one, but if you were to examine the scene very closely, you may find yourself seeing these scarecrows as a way for the deceased to choose an ending for their stories before passing on. When Numata had shown up the following morning to find his daughter's scarecrow on top of Toshio, the boy was found dead. No signs of trauma. It was like he had just passed away. And when seeing the sadness in Yuki's eyes, that was when the father realized the situation, that it was because of him his daughter had died. Now, being nothing more but a scarecrow outfitted in Yuki's clothing, that was the last time Numata visited the cemetery, too afraid to see the consequences of his actions. As for the boy, who had tragically died within an accident, that morning, a mother would witness a horrible truth when looking at the fear and rage on Shigeru's scarecrow. Those eyes focused on the stepfather, and even though you could see the nervousness within this man, passing it off as something ridiculous and creepy, moving to the other side of Shigeru's grave, the man began to panic when noticing Shigeru's eyes were following him. That look on the boy's face. A mother didn't need to hear any words to know the story that her son was trying to tell. And when the stepfather reacted to this with hostility, grabbing the scarecrow by the throat, exposing this hatred for the child that did nothing but get in his way, and pushing his wife aside while pulling out the scarecrow, that was when the stepfather carelessly found himself accidentally falling backwards, hitting his head on the gravestone, and died from being impaled by Shigeru's scarecrow. That was when the mother had finally realized the truth, that this man was the one who killed her son. And after realizing that, Shigeru's scarecrow had returned back into a normal object of sticks and straws, outfitted in the clothing of a child who was in fact murdered. It's a fact that there is no such thing as perfection. That no matter how good you are, there will always be something there to sour that greatness. Where the success of others is but fuel for another person's spite for his or her inability to reach the same level of achievement, and do the only thing that they know how to do best, bring that person down to their level. In today's tale, which brings us to a class reunion. Former students who are reliving the warming memories of junior high, and realize how one spiteful person can succeed on creating a self-destructive act that will have these people introduced to an unremitting horror. Introduction: Teranishi, who's now a mother of 3, and still having her stunning looks, as she joins her friends and fellow classmates on a class reunion, 20 years since these people graduated. Nothing but warming memories of the events they enjoyed, like the time they all went camping, competing in sports day, how their class came first. Everybody was so united. But there was one event that nobody will ever forget, which is very essential to this class reunion. That after graduation, everybody decided to bury a time capsule that contained various items that served as memories for their years in junior high. Mostly letters written to other students and artwork, alongside with a few objects. And today's main event will take place in the school garden, the site where the time capsule is buried, and where these former students will dig it up. And everybody can enjoy those memories and mementos as they read each other's letters. Except for Teranishi, who is trying to remember who she wrote her letter to. That was when she remembered a name, a terrible memory that lingered in the back of her mind. Shinoda, the only thing that tried spoiling the warming memories of junior high. What became of Shinoda was definitely a curiosity, an interesting conversation as they began digging up the time capsule. Shinoda, an oddball who had her own set of reasons of not fitting in, mostly because of her personality, which was unbearable. That Shinoda would constantly complain, criticize, and talk about nothing but herself. And even though most students tried avoiding her, it was only a matter of time before somebody would say something about her immature behavior. And that moment came during the preparation for the cultural festival, when the class decided on putting up a play and then assigned their own roles. With the exception of Shinoda, who did not want to participate, but instead decided to criticize and complain when seeing a fellow classmate, Takayama, being assigned to a leading role. Shinoda, who wasn't shy on speaking out her mind, began to express her harsh feedback of Takayama being given a role that she was not perfect for because of her physical appearance. And Shinoda sharing that feedback out loud, oblivious to the fact that Takayama was literally right behind her. Well, let's just say that Takayama and the entire class were fed up with Shinoda's behavior, her attitude towards others. When Takayama and the other class called out Shinoda for her criticism, saying that if Takayama wasn't perfect for the role, that if Shinoda knows so much about acting on stage, why not have Shinoda herself take the stage? Basically, Takayama proved that Shinoda didn't know anything about acting on stage, nor did she know what she was talking about. The only thing that was proven that day in class, that Shinoda was somebody who doesn't have the spine to do anything, and that her only talent was sitting on the sidelines and criticizing others because of her inability to fit in. That was the last time Shinoda communicated with anyone. But the real question is, what became of Shinoda? Is it possible that she may be part of this ceremony? That within those 20 years since graduation, she matured? And that was very important to Teranishi, because truth is, after graduation, when everybody was writing their letters, Teranishi kind of felt bad for Shinoda. Couldn't understand her personality, nor why it was so distorted, which is why she wrote a letter to Shinoda. Teranishi wanted to know what Shinoda would be like 20 years later, anticipating if she matured with age. But since showing up to the ceremony, there was no signs of Shinoda. And there was also something else. It was since graduation day when Teranishi had last saw Shinoda, but after that, Shinoda would keep contact with her, calling her every now and then, talking about the incident with Takayama and how the class scolded her. It was just a few days ago when Teranishi last spoke to Shinoda. For 20 years, every call, Shinoda would talk about that day. How much she hated Takayama and the other students. Teranishi found it intolerable. And when she tried changing the subject, Shinoda would get infuriated, disturbed by the fact that Shinoda remembered every little detail that day, 20 years ago. After an hour of hard labor, digging up the time capsule, everybody was anticipating this moment. The moment where everybody can enjoy the mementos that were kept inside this capsule for 20 years. And as everybody crowded around the capsule, immediately removing the screws and lifting the lid, the excitement, the joy on everybody's face was slowly turned to dread when seeing what was inside the capsule. All those warming memories, the achievements, the happiness, ending with this moment turning into a horror story. As it turns out, Sanaka did show up to the ceremony, except after graduation, somehow she snuck into the capsule before it got buried, had a telephone with her, tore up all the letters and artwork. One girl who successfully destroyed this moment out of spite and vengeance. And it was a few days ago when Teranishi last spoke to Shinoda. 20 years, buried within the capsule with a phone that shouldn't have worked. No food, no water, which leaves Teranishi a haunting curiosity. If she would still be receiving more calls from Shinoda. Have I got a special yarn of terror for you, my friends? More like a unique lesson in evil. For years up to this very day, man had defined evil as a force that likes to lurk over the shoulder of humanity. And that may be true, persuading us with those temptations. However, any devil can tell you that when it comes to evil, it isn't the devil that seeks to ruin you. It's the choices that are made when one decides to seize the opportunity to embrace his or her deepest, darkest desires. Of course, one cannot say that the devil does own up to his part of the bargain and provide those pleasures. It's just that when it comes to paying the price, facing the consequences, most people are never fully prepared for the consequences that follow. And instead of taking full responsibility for their actions, their choices, people would rather pin their decisions on the one that fulfilled their darkened fantasies, which explains why the devil has such a bad reputation. Introduction: Yuki, and the gentleman you see hiding in the blanket is her boyfriend Tomio. What you are now witnessing is a scene that one would find to be comical, bizarre, or concerning. A full-grown man hiding away within his blanket because of a crippling fear. The blanket, which had somehow become the only place where Tomio could find safety and shelter, refusing to leave his blanket because of an intense fear of the world around him. It's been like this for almost 3 months now, since the day that Tomio began saying that there was something at the window, stalking him. Now he claims that there are demons everywhere, that not only in the room, the house, but the whole world is literally full of demons, and it's all because of that thing at the window. Of course, Yuki had never seen any of the demons, nor whatever it is that her boyfriend keeps talking about. But I assure you, my friends, it's only a matter of time before Yuki would be introduced to this horror that had confined Tomio within his blanket. As a result of Tomio's agoraphobia, life for Yuki had become an unexpected struggle because of her love and devotion for her boyfriend. Even though she tried convincing Tomio to see a psychologist for his condition, her boyfriend refused to seek help. Instead, he spent his days inside the house, refusing to step outside, spending most of his time in the bedroom, hiding inside his blanket. At first, Tomio would do basic stuff, like leaving the blanket to use the toilet and sometimes to eat. But it wasn't until a couple weeks later, Tomio began fully isolating himself within the blanket. using diapers as an alternative way to use the restroom and eating food within the blanket itself. And it was Yuki who ended up becoming the one who suffered the most, mostly because of how she was the one who had to take care of Tomio. Life was extremely hard for Yuki, working full shift in the day and taking care of her boyfriend at night, day after day. This had taken a mental and physical toll on the poor woman. But on one night, Yuki was about to experience an unremitting horror when finally seeing the nightmarish world that had confined her boyfriend inside the blanket. When Yuki woken up in the middle of the night, it was like the world around her had warped itself into a shifting amalgam of grotesque monstrosities. The entire bedroom was filled with these demons and devils, reaching out with their elongated claws, their fingers twitching and creeping on her blanket. The entire room had changed into a realm of violated flesh, gaping mouths, eyes, and tendrils everywhere, stretching and moving in all directions, welcoming Yuki into their beautiful wonderland of pain and suffering, just itching to have their filthy claws on Yuki. Immediately, Yuki panicked, terrified of the nightmare that filled her room. And now that Yuki had finally saw the horrors that had been haunting Tomio, that was when Tomio began seeking forgiveness, trying to explain this horror by pointing out a specific monstrosity, a female demon that was riding one of the tendrils, laughing hysterically. She is the reason for this nightmare, all part of her devious plan. However, the female demon isn't the one who should be taking full credit for all this, and finally coming clean by confessing a terrible sin. Tomio admitted that before all this happened, on the night when Yuki wasn't home, he had an affair with a woman he met on the street. But when this woman started saying things like how she was a demon, Tomio got scared and decided to break off all contact with her. As a result of Tomio's actions, that was when he finally realized that this woman was in fact a demon. Truth is, all of this was because of Tomio. The demon woman and the nightmares that she brought was just the consequences of his selfish actions to feed his desires. Overwhelmed with fear, grief, and rage, Yuki fled and ran away from that house, leaving Tomio with the horrors he had brought upon himself. A month later, Yuki decided to go back to the apartment. It took some time, but eventually Yuki convinced herself that what she saw was a hallucination or a nightmare due to stress and being overworked. Regardless of her boyfriend admitting that he had an affair, Yuki was still concerned for Tomio. Couldn't help but feel that leaving him like that was the wrong thing to do, especially with his agoraphobia. Finding the apartment unkept and a powerful stench lingering in the air, Tomio was still hiding inside the blanket, unresponsive. Based off the food scraps and emptied bottles of water, it seems like Tomio left his blanket a few times. Just a few times. But when Yuki removed the blanket that covered Tomio's body, revealing a sticky substance inside the blanket, what she saw was Tomio covered with this greenish, glowing thick slime. If it wasn't for Yuki, Tomio could have died. Even though the authorities couldn't find any trace of the demon woman, the strange substance that was found on Tomio's body and inside the blanket was a newly discovered bacteria, and after a great deal of research, it was said that the side effects of being exposed to this bacteria would cause major hallucinations. I love it when I see people stumbling onto this channel, looking to satisfy their appetite for scares and creepy thrills. No, my friends, I'm not here to scare you. I'm just a host for the wonderful world of horror. Today's lesson, my friends, is a tale of a guilty conscience. How someone's lust for self-satisfaction would drive that individual into doing the unthinkable, and quickly realize that reaping the rewards is not worth the price. A guilty conscience is a lot of weight to carry, so vulnerable to that feeling of fear, of being caught. Can you imagine living in the world with that kind of guilt on your back? The anxiety, the intense feeling when someone is eyeing you when walking down the street, or even knocking on your door. Knowing that every day you would be looking over your shoulder, not knowing how or when, but knowing that there will come a time where you will have to face the consequences. Introduction to Kano, a bright and charming young man who has had a strong love for his hobby, collecting beehives. Recently, his girlfriend Yoriko noticed something a bit off with Takano's behavior. Bees and wasps was something he used to talk about. It was like every conversation was one-sided and all about bees and wasps and its collection of hives. But now, he avoids the topic as if Takano had suddenly lost interest in his hobby, or something was on his mind. But when noticing a rare giant hornet carrying a wad of meat, suddenly overwhelmed with that inner excitement, Takano immediately began chasing the insect, and seeing the hornet flying lower, meaning that the hive was nearby, it wasn't until the insect flew right into the woods that was when Takano suddenly stopped. Of all places, the hornet had to fly right into those woods. Even though Yoriko began noticing her boyfriend's strange behavior when refusing to enter the woods, playing it off, claiming that Takano was afraid of the ghost that's been haunting these woods lately. Supposedly, it was a kid that went missing a few weeks ago. But rather than worrying about some hive, or a ghost story about a weird kid who haunts these woods, Takano felt it would be best to go back to his place, been wanting to show Yoriko his new collection of hives. Turning down a great finding because of a ghost story? It's interesting how they say that language is 7% verbal, and Takano here, oblivious to the fact that people are noticing how the other 93% is speaking much differently. With his girlfriend impressed with Takano's collection of hives, 3 times bigger than the last time she saw his collection, he had this idea of wanting to open up a museum. But aside from the collection of hives, I guess the gossip and rumors of the missing boy was much more of an interesting topic. The missing boy, that weird kid who helped her remove a hive from under the eaves of her house a while back. There's rumors going around that not only it's his ghost that haunts the woods, but there are people who believe that somewhere within those woods is his buried body. Yoriko had never forgotten that day when the kid helped her remove the hive. More like a special day, seeing how that was the first time she met Takano. And how could Takano forget about the weird kid? Especially that day. That day was like a stroke of luck when Takano found that hive at Yoriko's house, just walking down the street until he saw a beautiful hive just waiting to be taken, which is why he agreed to remove the hive at nightfall, a perfect time to remove it because of how the wasps are asleep, and less risks of being attacked. And just as Takano had thought that he had found another piece for his small collection, that was when he showed up, the strange kid who agreed to remove the hive immediately, without the need of protection or insecticide. Takano was both shocked and impressed when watching the kid use the ladder, grabbing the hive without getting a sting. If he didn't know better, it was like the kid was communicating with the wasps. Of course, Takano had heard about this kid, a social misfit who goes around removing hives with his bare hands, likes to talk to himself, and supposedly he would be seen with wasps on him, showing no fear. However, there was a growing suspicion that Takano had about this kid, seeing how someone had been stealing the beehives that Takano found. Basically, the kid had a negative view of the town, feeling that the wasps were here before they cut down the trees, and people began moving in, which explains why there's so many bees and wasps. The kid wasn't shy on expressing his hatred for exterminators, and especially people like Takano, robbing the insects of their home just to satisfy his self-interests, which explains why Takano quickly learned that confronting the kid and trying to claim ownership of the hive was a terrible idea when it resulted with Takano being attacked by a swarm of wasps before the kid ran off. It was after Takano managed to flee from the attacking swarm. That was when he was found by Yuriko, and the two started to have a connection. Even though Takano's hopes of a beautiful find were taken away by that strange kid, a week later, Takano was about to find himself coming across a huge discovery, alongside with Yuriko, his new girlfriend, showing her the techniques on luring wasps with tuna. You see, when the wasp finds the tuna, it would create a food ball from the tuna and fly it back to the hive to feed its larvae. And marking the tuna with cotton, Takano can use it as a tracer and follow the wasp back to its nest. And both Takano and Yuriko chasing the wasp deep into the woods, all the way to a cave. It was obvious that the hive must be inside the cave, so having Yuriko wait outside as Takano went in to investigate, fearing that she would be attacked by the wasps. What Takano saw when entering the cave was something much more than he expected. It was that kid, surrounded by wasps, bees, and hornets, and above him was a vast collection of hives. This scene was impossible. In all his years on collecting hives, Takano couldn't believe that he was seeing different species of wasps and bees being together, swarming the kid as if they had accepted him as one of their own. But Takano could not resist admiring that collection of hives, imagining himself with a magnificent collection of his own. Even began entertaining this sinister idea of opening up a museum of his own. Takano didn't share his discovery with Yuriko, saying that the hive was too small before leaving. But I think we all know what really did happen to that strange kid. And if you've guessed that Takano had plans of visiting that cave later that night, prepared with full body protection and equipment, a tragic incident that resulted with Takano doing something terrible to that kid, like strangling the boy, just to reap the spoils. You've guessed right. So with people talking about the missing kid being buried in the woods, it's just a matter of time before that kind of gossip and ghost stories would have people start digging and uncovering Takano's grisly secret behind his new collection. Which explains why Takano decided to visit those woods that night and relocate the body someplace further away. But instead of finding the exact location where he buried the kid, Takano had found a marker, meaning that earlier today, bee hunters were here. Must have found this hive in the ground. That hornet he saw this afternoon, flying into these woods, this must be the hive he was looking for. And seeing how Takano brought insecticide, he decided to seize the opportunity and grabbing himself another beautiful piece to his collection, before finding the kid. After ridding the hive of its gatekeepers, and doing a little digging, Takano's moment of embracing his lucky find would suddenly be interrupted by the rightful owners of the hive, who had returned that night to dig up their find. frantically trying to pull the hive from the ground, which must have been rooted deep into the soil. That was when Takano decided to use the shovel to cut the hive from the root, grab the stolen prize, and run off before the bee hunters were just moments away from catching him. Well, with his plans on moving the kid's body being sidetracked, and spending his night examining his stolen prize, Takano was a bit concerned with the blood he found on the hive. It was a lot of blood. Must have killed a mole or something when he cut at the root with the shovel. Either way, Takano was happy that he had found another piece to his collection of hives. Isn't obsession the single most wasteful and self-destructive human activity? It's like somebody coming back again and again for the same results, but oblivious to their surroundings. Takano, who's been so focused on his hobbies, so devoted that he's willing to commit murder to embrace his selfish desires, unaware that his actions had created something far worse than a ghost story, but an actual murder that had shocked the town. The kind of gossip that would not only have Yuriko running to her boyfriend's house, waking up the troubled man to share the horrible news. Last night, the missing boy was found. Not only had a couple bee hunters found his body in the woods, but the boy's head had been chopped off. It was still bleeding, and they had also seen the murderer running off with his head. And right now, the police are searching for that man. That fear, my friends, that had been dwelling inside Takano. Takano's mind racing with so many thoughts, heart beating so loud and fast. Speechless, sweating, his mind and body trying to understand the reality of the situation, shutting the door on his girlfriend, ignoring her attempts of reaching out and understanding her boyfriend's frantic behavior. Takano was now focused on the hive he brought home last night. The blood. Trying to deny this crazy thought that was on his mind when looking at the blood-covered hive. It didn't make any sense, but when opening up the hive, the horror was confirmed when Takano found himself looking at the eyes of the strange kid. His head was inside the hive. And all of a sudden, it all started to make sense. It must have been the hornets that built the hive around the kid. And the tuna balls were also for the kid. And the rumors of people hearing the kid crying for help, which must have meant Takano was not successful in killing the boy. Instead, he buried him alive before taking his collection of hives. And it was the hornets that cared for the kid and kept him alive this whole time. Until last night, when Takano chopped off the kid's head. A selfish man who committed a crime gone horribly wrong just to feed his obsession. Obviously, justice is coming for Takano, but not the way he would expect when seeing his room being filled with giant hornets. Not sure if they had came through an open window or they were inside the hive. Immediately, the hornets began swarming and attacking Takano, paralyzing the man, biting into his flesh, making tiny balls of meat from his body, feeding the boy's decapitated head before mending the broken hive. Very soon, their home will be whole again.
So today's story, my friends, we'll be focusing on that sad and strange stumbling looking fella in the red turtleneck. His face that's full of terror, skin that is pale white, drenched with sweat and carrying the strong stench of body odor and stale copper, obviously displaying such a bizarre scene, having people nearby wondering if he's either trying to cover his ears or holding his head in place. Definitely the kind of person who has a story to share. And believe me, my friends, there is a story to share. A story that he will never forget for the rest of his miserable life. Poor Tomio. If he only knew how the odds are incredibly against him right now, that his stubborn will to survive may not be enough to escape the vicious curse that is lurking over him. Making sure that every step he takes is slow, cautious, just to make sure he doesn't lose that sense of precise balance, that his full concentration is to stay focused on each and every movement he makes. Oh yes, his hands are now tired, turning numb, but he has to ignore the pain. For the sake of his own life, Tomio must stay focused, just long enough to reach Sanaka's apartment. The only person who can help him. His ex-girlfriend, Sanaka, a poor woman who's been recently hurt, distraught by the selfish actions of her ex-boyfriend. It was a common killer among promising relationships. It was an affair that Tomio had ended up sharing a forbidden love with another woman a few days ago. Quite the tragedy. It can definitely bring a lot of anguish, a lot of spite within a woman, which of course doesn't improve Tomio's chances of getting out of the nasty situation that he's currently in. So, it all began about 3 days ago, when Tomio and Sanaka were nothing more than a loving couple who thought that by having their fortune told would be a harmless experience that would bring this loving couple closer together. You know, the fortune that shows a future where Sanaka and Tomio would live a long and happy life together. Except, only this fortune wasn't as pleasant as Sanaka expected. The fortune teller had not only blatantly foretold the tragic ending of such a promising relationship, but had captured Tomio's full attention with her gaze. Oh yes, Tomio's attention was definitely fixated, alright, and Sanaka knew that look. That regardless of how unbelievable it was, her lover, Tomio, was deeply mesmerized by this woman. The experience with the fortune teller was not only a horrible experience that was quite bizarre, but had soured the relationship between Sanaka and Tomio. That Tomio was so captivated by the beautiful presence of the fortune teller, the way she looked at him. He knew that this woman wanted him, and of course, he too had an overwhelming desire for her as well. A desire that was more powerful than a future with Sanaka. So as Tomio would shamefully partake a wonderful night with this captivating fortune teller, the woman couldn't help but confess her love for Tomio. Well, actually, couldn't help but confess her love for his head. Not the first time Tomio's been with a woman who said some strange things during moments like this. Even didn't really care when she asked for his freshly human head, because of how much she loved collecting pretty human heads. Tomio just couldn't help but feel entertained by this woman's strange idea for foreplay, which is why Tomio amused himself with the woman's bizarre and morbid request, saying that he was more than willing to give her his precious head. So what this woman did was pluck out a single string of her own hair, gently wrapping the hair around Tomio's neck to where it fitted nicely around Tomio's neck, and squeezed it to where Tomio was unable to breathe, possibly assuming that the hair would break, or maybe this woman was truly into the kinky crazy stuff, which Tomio didn't really mind, by the way. But it was when Tomio began feeling this small, thin, tickling sensation around his neck, something like a long, sharp paper cut, for example. That was when he started to get a little bit worried that this kinky foreplay was getting a little too overboard, even for a guy who was willing to try anything for such a mesmerizing woman. Whatever this woman did, Tomio didn't like the fact that she managed to leave a mark around his neck, wasn't even fading away. Frustrated by the idea of having to go out while looking like this, I guess Tomio was, well, kind of relieved that the woman had a spare shirt lying around, didn't want to ask where she got it, and didn't really enjoy the fact that he was going to have to wear a turtleneck. Yeah, the woman was definitely a bizarre one. If Tomio had only knew that he was but a mere fly that was caught within a spider's web, that if our lucky boy had only stayed faithful to his original love, if he weren't so blinded by the lustful looks for this beautiful woman, that such a foolish mistake would make him into a victim of a monster that has shared an incredible love for every man who had once worshipped her, who were foolish enough to give her the very thing that she so desired: a fresh human head. Now, I think it was instincts that had Tomio running for his own selfish life, not even thinking of the very few important curiosities as to why his wicked lover had made the effort of stopping him after giving him such a show. You see, the tragedy is, Tomio ain't really going to go that far, all thanks to that white turtleneck shirt he's wearing. The thing is, it also has the woman's hair within it. A single strand of hair that is stronger than wire, and carefully tightening itself around the neck to where poor Tomio couldn't breathe. Well, maybe it was sorcery that was making him breathe, but it wasn't stopping the hair from finishing its course of slicing into Tomio's neck, and before Tomio knew it, his shirt had quickly begun to turn into the color of crimson red. And as Tomio had begun feeling the hair tightening around the spinal, giving away a loud and muffled crackling sound, a sound that had given Tomio an overwhelming sensation of terror, he knew that he was now in trouble, that the only thing keeping this poor, selfish boy alive is his intense focus on keeping his head in its rightful place. For if he were to lose focus, or even let his guard down, then poor Tomio would finally be relieved from such a miserable and tormenting experience before fulfilling his part of the bargain. Now you gotta understand why Sanaka refuses to believe such an outlandish story, especially after Tomio had foolishly chosen a forbidden night with the witch. Even the tears, the paleness, the stench of stale sweat and copper wasn't enough to convince Sanaka that there was something definitely wrong with Tomio. But his persistence, the terror, the tears that were filling his eyes, had given Sanaka the inner feeling that Tomio's visit wasn't a petty way of seeking forgiveness, that there was a curiosity she found within Tomio's frightening words that had driven her into visually witnessing the gruesome wound around Tomio's neck, carefully hidden within the turtleneck. And as she peeled down the turtleneck, that was wet, sticky, revealing such a violent horror show that had given Sanaka a cringe-worthy experience. Even the small splurt of blood coming from Tomio's neck was a nice touch. It was like a living nightmare had just stepped on her front doorstep and more like stumbling right into Sanaka's home. Sanaka's first reaction, which is more like a normal reaction in a situation like this, was that she wanted nothing to do with Tomio or the nightmare that he was bringing into her home. And even though she didn't hesitate on calling for an ambulance, reporting a beheading without giving the full details, either she couldn't nor she didn't want to, I think that was the moment when Sanaka had begun to feel pity for this young man, who had ultimately betrayed her. I mean, sure, Tomio should suffer the consequences for his selfish actions, but not like this. That deep down within Sanaka's heart, past the hatred she had for Tomio, she knew that this was no way for somebody to suffer, regardless of what he had done. Sanaka just couldn't bear to see Tomio face such a violent death. Sanaka knew that Tomio's legs, his body, were exhausted, especially his hands, which should be numb and throbbing with pain, barely able to keep his head in place. It's practically a miracle that Tomio's still alive. and as she tried to ease Tomio's feelings of terror and possibly relieve the stress that were being put onto his legs by having him focus on trying to sit down so that Tomio wouldn't panic or risk losing his head. She could tell that the effort of sitting down was an unbearable task for Tomio, possibly more difficult than someone balancing on a high wire. And just as Tomio had nearly found himself reaching that grand moment of slight relaxation, achieving just enough time before getting the proper medical attention for his bizarre situation. It may have been that slight moment of anticipation for relief, where his body had completely given away and collapsed onto the floor. That was when Sanaka had seen Tomio's head completely separated from his body. Now, even though there was a slight moment of panic there, thankfully Tomio didn't lose his head, and he's still okay. Well, I wouldn't say okay would be the proper term, but at least his head is still somewhat intact when he quickly put it back on his shoulders again. Now, the overwhelming feelings of panic was becoming a problem for Tomio, knowing that he was just a split second away from death, not knowing if it was either a miracle because of how he was still alive, or the cruel form of torture that was coming from this vile curse. Either way, it was definitely an experience that was agonizing and unbearable. And just as Tomio and Sanaka had heard the knocking on the front door, feeling the small wave of hope, when assuming that it was the rescue team. Instead, Sanaka would be greeted by a familiar face. The fortune teller, the other lover, or like the witch who had come to relieve Tomio's stubbornness to live, to put an end to his miserable pain and finally obtain another piece for her grizzly collection of trophies. Examining her magic performing its wonderful work on Tomio, while enjoying the fact that Tomio would rather continue with the suffering and the torment, rather than handing over the very thing that he promised to give. Of course, Tomio didn't know what was really happening. Oh yes, Tomio's life is hanging by a thread. But it's not that simple when it comes to someone who refuses to give what was promised. Even though the art of seduction usually does its job for the witch, it's just when the victim chooses to be so stubborn, that's where a little persuasion is needed. A little nudge in the right direction to help Tomio be relieved from such a nightmarish torment. Even though Tomio's ex-girlfriend may not understand what's happening, nor that she needs to really, it wouldn't be wise if she were to interfere. Who knows? Maybe one wrong move can make Tomio's brain spill everywhere. Now, the witch will confess that Tomio is definitely one of the most relentless people she had ever met, as unyielding as a cockroach, which is why she would deal with such a pest by fighting fire with fire, introducing the roach into the opening of Tomio's neck as he felt the insect slowly make its way into its new home, giving Tomio such a tickling sensation, an intense pain, the wonderful discomfort, such an experience that sent poor Tomio into a panic, desperately fighting for his life while being violated by the insect. Such a joyful scene, small moments like this where the witch couldn't resist embracing. But when the witch had felt a sudden thud on the back of her head, she knew that this was when the horror show was finally coming to its end, when Sanaka had stabbed the witch in the neck with a pair of scissors. Of course, the witch didn't die right away, not without giving Sanaka a good scare for her foolishness and ungrateful battling. And just as the witch had finally collapsed, falling face first onto the ground, giving Tomio and Sanaka the idea that the torment is finally over, that the witch's death had hopefully ended the horrible curse. Oh, and as for the roach, well, it turned out that Tomio had accidentally swallowed it during the struggle. But the show wasn't over yet, my friends. You see, not only had the witch's body found itself being consumed by flames, but what stood among the remains of this once beautiful witch were what seemed to be 3 demonic children, whose attention were focused on Tomio. Poor Tomio. Just when he thought that he was finally free from such a terrible nightmare, free from the vile clutches of a witch and her godforsaken curse, now here he is, desperately struggling for his own survival against these demonic monsters, finally realizing that the efforts against this curse was hopeless. No matter what Tomio did to ensure his own survival, he knew that he would eventually end up losing his precious head. Well, my friends, I know that it may sound unbelievable, but I can assure you that Tomio did not end up losing his head. I mean, sure, there was a moment where Sanaka had thought that Tomio had died, but I guess as a result from the witch's death, it seemed that the horrible curse was lifted as well. As for the demonic children, well, they were most likely an illusion, but the witch wasn't, nor was the fact that Tomio's head was actually separated from his body. Or could that have also been an illusion as well? Now, even though this story would come with something of a happy ending after Sanaka had found herself forgiving Tomio and his selfish actions, well, the truth is, Tomio would have probably been better off dead, seeing how the incident had definitely traumatized him. That every day poor Tomio is plagued by the horrid memories of the witch's curse, which is why he still refuses to remove his hands from his precious head, still afraid, still petrified of losing his head. Well, my friends, I do hope you enjoyed today's wonderful tale of terror. If you're interested in wanting to know what stories I'll be doing next, or you just want to be friends, then you can follow me on Twitter with the link below. Anyways, please feel free for any questions, comments, or any fun corrections. Until next time, thank you for watching The Horror Show. Is it not fascinating how we humans would naturally have a fear or a strong sense of discomfort with any living creature that violates our way of normal living, such as flies, ants, roaches, spiders, mice, even slugs? And even though our relationship with these specific creatures is often misunderstood, that we normally refer to these creepy crawlies as nothing more than vile pests, when in reality they're just living things acting out of survival. Some of us, however, are convinced with the delusional idea that these creatures of infestation are the very monsters that haunt us at night, just waiting for the right moment to consume us. Well, my friends, of course we all know that these pests are not out to get us, that it's just our sense of fear and discomfort getting the better of our imagination. But what if one day the worst of your twisted imagination was real? What if one day the unexpected had happened and your delusional sense of fear had become an unbearable nightmare in the worst way possible? That, my friends, is what happens within today's story. You see, Yuko here, she's been having a bit of trouble lately. Usually she's been known to be quite the chatty girl, but on one day, something happened. Don't know what exactly, but for some reason she didn't really talk as much as she used to. It was like she was in some kind of discomfort. And as time went on, eventually Yuko had just stopped talking. I mean, she could still talk, of course, but the thing was, it wasn't that easy. Her pronunciation was extremely broken. It even got to the point where nobody could even understand her. It was like her tongue was swelled up or something. And even though at first Yuko's parents had tried to have her seen for her mysterious condition, well, I guess it got so bad where Yuko had suddenly stopped going to school. Since Yuko had stopped going to school, some were very concerned with her health, especially her best friend Rei. You see, Rei and Yuko had been considered as close friends for a very long time, which is why Rei had decided to visit Yuko after school. acting out as a supporting friend who wanted to help Yuko enduring through a troubling moment, hopefully cheer her up and all that. Of course, it didn't come to no surprise when Ray found Yuko's parents in the backyard having a bit of trouble on trying to deal with the slug infestation. That was the thing about Yuko's house, was that their backyard had barely seen any sunlight. It was always damp and completely infested with slugs, and no matter how hard Yuko's parents had tried to kill the slimy creatures, whether it's by stomping on them or showering them with bags of salt, they just keep coming back. It's like they never die. Now, even though Yuko's condition hadn't gotten any better since she left school, Yuko's mother was definitely happy to see Ray visiting her daughter during such a troubling time. It's been days where Yuko had spent most of her time being isolated within her room. It's been 2 weeks since she even left the house. Now it's gotten to the point where Yuko refuses to join the rest of her family. It's like she's trying to keep herself hidden from the world itself. But when finding Yuko wearing a face mask, that was when Ray and Yuko's mother were starting to get a little bit more concerned. Even though it was obvious that Yuko was now at the point where she was incapable to speak properly, you could see clearly through her eyes that there was definitely something wrong. There was something not right. Something that was far worse than a girl struggling with a mental condition. Looking through her eyes, you could easily tell that Yuko was experiencing fear. Seeing Yuko's violent reaction towards her mother was something that Ray did not expect, but the fear within Yuko's eyes, that was something else. Last time Ray remembered Yuko showing that kind of fear and anger was during the time within elementary school where one day Ray and her friends had played what they thought was an innocent prank by trying to scare Yuko with one of the slugs in her backyard. Much like today, Yuko's backyard was incredibly full of slugs during the time. Of course, Ray and everybody else didn't really care for the slugs, but as for Yuko, well, it turned out that she had this intense fear for the slimy creatures. Her reaction to the prank had definitely shocked Ray and the others. And since the incident, Yuko had never went into the backyard again. The following day will be an incident that Ray will never tell another soul. Even if she were to find the right words to explain what happened when she visited Yuko's house, I don't think anybody would have believed her. Immediately, Ray was introduced to the sudden screams from Yuko's mother, hearing the frantic cries for a doctor and something about Yuko's tongue. It was when Ray saw Yuko just standing there with that frozen look of disbelief. And that was when the thing had begun protruding from her mouth. Oh no, it wasn't Yuko's tongue that was sticking out of her mouth, but a giant slug. Somehow, Yuko's tongue had turned into a slug. And I guess for quite some time, Yuko's been trying to hide this shocking discovery from her friends, her family, and everybody else. I don't know, maybe wait it out until it goes away, but the true horror had finally came when Yuko had just realized that she no longer had any control over her own tongue, which had literally became a living creature that resided within her mouth. Till this day, Ray will never forget the fear, no, the pure terror in Yuko's eyes. It was like Ray had just stepped into a nightmare that was disgusting and beyond frightening, and seeing the tears within Yuko's eyes as she desperately tried to scream for help, which were muffled by the slimy body of the slug. That was the last time Ray had seen Yuko before she ran out of the house in fear. Now, as to what happened to Yuko after that horrible day was something that Ray had only heard from Yuko's parents. Several times, Yuko had tried cutting her tongue with a pair of scissors, and no matter how many times she tried, the slug kept growing back. Her father had tried putting large amounts of salt into her mouth, and of course that didn't work either. Immediately, Yuko would spit out the salt as if she couldn't take it. Now, it's not known if Yuko was seen by a doctor, or maybe that her parents were uncomfortable with the idea to seek any medical attention for Yuko's bizarre condition. Maybe it was because of the fear of bad publicity. But as Yuko and her parents were running out of ideas to take care of this bizarre situation, that was when things started to get from bad to worse, when Yuko was barely able to eat because of the slug, causing her to be malnourished by the day. Even parts of Yuko's face had begun turning into the color shining silver because of the amount of time the slug had been crawling all over her. Eventually, Yuko's parents had gotten desperate to the point where her father had decided to fill the entire bathtub with nothing but salt, knowing that by doing this would be very tough and painful for Yuko. Yuko's parents were convinced that it should be enough to kill the damn slug by having it buried in salt. And just as Yuko followed her father's orders by getting into the tub, watching their daughter quietly submerge herself within the salt, anticipating the results of seeing their daughter being free from this horrible nightmare, it was when Yuko's parents had realized that their daughter had been lying beneath the salt much longer than they expected. And out of the fear that Yuko may have fainted, Yuko's father didn't waste any time on trying to get his daughter out of the tub as quickly as possible. Now, I think when Yuko's parents had seen the results of their desperate attempt, there was just no way they were prepared for what they pulled out of the tub of salt. What had become of their daughter, more like what was left of their daughter. Surprising enough, despite the fact that it seemed like Yuko had lost her body, which had actually shrunken as a result from the salt bath, Yuko was still alive. But I'm not sure that's actually a good thing, especially due to the fact that the slug was also still alive as well. And like a snail, the slug ended up carrying Yuko's head on its back. Supposedly this is what Rei had heard from Yuko's parents, and even though Rei may be the only one who would believe such a bizarre and insane story, especially after what she had seen on that horrible day. The thing is, Rei knows that there is just no way that she could find the strength to see what had become of Yuko, to see the sadness in her eyes. Nothing but a head being carried by a slug that now lives in the very place that Yuko hates and fears. Well, my friends, I thank you for watching today's horrible tale of terror. If you have any interest as to what stories I'll be doing next, or you just want to be friends, then follow me on Twitter. Anyways, please feel free for any questions, comments, or any fun corrections. Until next episode, thank you for watching The Horror Show. By all means, have a seat. Relax while we enjoy this wonderful little story. Now, for myself and the joys of writing, relaxation is quite the importance in ensuring that I have the proper necessities such as the comforts of a chair, an instrument of tranquility that would help ease my flowing mind. Personally, I would have never conceived the idea that a chair would play such an important role within somebody's life. It's unthinkable. But for one woman in today's story, I think her curiosity and search for a piece of furniture is about to give her an experience that she will never forget, where she will learn of the importance of a chair and how it can become your future, your destiny. You see, she's a writer from Tokyo who's captured the attention of a young and ambitious craftsman. Of course, he knows that this young and beautiful woman isn't just following her curiosity by looking for a chair. Oh no, he knows. He knows that it was destiny that had guided her right into this store. Now he knows that it's just not any chair that this young woman is looking for, not the kind that would cause damage throughout the body after a period of time. What she's looking for is a chair that could change your life. Besides, it's happened before, in the past. Quite the story to share, best be told by luring this woman into the secret room in the back, where there was nothing but an armchair that was old, detailed, perfectly crafted. Now, this chair plays a major role within the story of Togawa Yoshiko, a stunning woman who is also a thing of absolute beauty. She was the wife to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she was also a renowned author during the Taisho era, a writer by coincidence. So just about every day, Yoshiko would receive an amount of anonymous letters from aspiring young authors seeking her well-respected criticism and opinions. But on one day, there was also this manuscript that had captured her eye. There was no title, anonymous author. Yoshiko couldn't help but notice how it began with Madam, as if it was specifically written for her, which was absurd. But the writing, it was very vivid, unbelievably well written. At first it seemed like a story, a bizarre one indeed. It was about a carpenter who was described to be a man that was beyond ugly, and had eventually decided to pursue a strange life of hiding within a specifically designed chair that was crafted by his own hand. Originally, this chair had resided within the guest lobby of a hotel, and as this man had spent his days residing within that very chair, this bizarre act had not only given the man the advantage of robbing the hotel and its guests throughout the night, but developed a bizarre form of interactions with those who would sit upon this very chair that he was in. But when the chair was later sold to an official during a market sale, he'll never forget the strong feelings of intimacy he had developed with the official's wife, a woman who would spend her nights sitting upon her husband's chair, her favorite chair, that would help ease her body, relieve her mind. Now Yoshiko had not only found this story bizarre, but disturbing, uncomfortable when she began realizing that this manuscript was not written as a story but as a confession, feeling that this letter was written specifically for her. She began to experience an unnerving sensation, dwelling on the horrible reality of a man living in a chair, while committing horrendous crimes, holding a fascination for her. She too is an owner of a similar chair. It was her favorite chair that would help her with her writing. But when Yoshiko had received a letter that confirmed the strange manuscript as a fake after she recommended it to her publisher, that was when our beautiful writer had been relieved of an unbearable sense of terror. However, my friends, that was also the beginning. For a moment, the manuscript had succeeded on giving Yoshiko a good scare. But as it turns out, the human chair was not only a fake, but was found to be one of the most finest pieces of literature, a disturbing story that had even outperformed Yoshiko's work. But the strange thing about this manuscript was that not only the story was fake, but the address of the author was also a fake. Kind of stressful, being outperformed by a newcomer. They couldn't even trace the address. And as Yoshiko began washing away her troubling thoughts, relaxing in her husband's chair, her favorite chair that they got a couple weeks ago, but somewhere in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but dwell on the part of the story where the chair was bought by an official. And I think that was when Yoshiko had begun experiencing a creeping fear, more like a sickening fear. Later that day, my friends, Yoshiko had to know. She just had to know. So she reluctantly asked her husband, where exactly did he buy the armchair? Such a strange curiosity, even when seeing the amount of discomfort and fear that his lovely wife was displaying. But if Mr. Yoshiko remembers it correctly, he bought it at the Y marketplace during sales. That night, Yoshiko could not sleep. She could not free her mind of the possibility of a man hiding in a chair that was in their study room. It had to be a coincidence. But that dwelling fear, my friends, would suddenly be interrupted by the sounds of footsteps. It couldn't be the servants. Not at this time of the night. They weren't this loud. No. Those were the sounds of something else, something sinister. Forcing her husband from a peaceful slumber, the fear that had been dwelling within Yoshiko throughout the day was now becoming a reality, especially when the strange sounds were coming from the study room. It couldn't be a man living in a chair. It was just a story written by a twisted genius, and with Yoshiko's husband ignoring her hysterical behavior, knowing that these were the sounds of a thief, nothing more. Yoshiko could not resist the surreal feeling that she was now stepping into a world of horror. Upon entering the study room, the sounds had ceased. Nothing seemed stolen. No signs of any disturbances was found, and yet Yoshiko could not resist her focus from the armchair, a piece of rare furniture, lying still, and as Yoshiko had hoped, even prayed that it was just her imagination getting the better of her, begging for the human chair to be nothing but a mere horror story. Yoshiko had begun to ease her troubling mind. Then that's when the chair moved. Even though Yoshiko's husband had not witnessed the event, that the idea of a man living in an armchair was nothing but a reflection of his wife's wild imagination, her persistence of having the armchair being thoroughly inspected was now becoming annoying and very frustrating. So, to put an end to his wife's hysterical actions, Yoshiko's husband had violently beaten the chair, relieving all of his anger, his frustrations upon a piece of valuable furniture, proving to his wife that the human chair was nothing but a fragment of her wild imagination. It had been 3 days since that fearful night, and even though Yoshiko's husband had eased her fears of a man living in their armchair, yet she had still refused from sitting on the chair. Even though the human chair was nothing but a story, those feelings of discomfort were still there. Somehow, they had spoiled her writing, inflicting a terrible stress upon her. Then came the letter that would be found among the collected works of several young authors. Anonymous author, same address, only this time it was now addressed to her. Madam, you haven't been sitting in your chair lately. You don't know how lonely I've been. Also, when you cruelly hit me a few days ago, do you know how painful that was, madam? Your husband is too much, madam. No, it isn't because of the beating, but rather he is jealous of your career. I know, madam. I know that your job as a writer is more important than your husband. Besides, this armchair is an essential item for your work. I know that when you allow yourself in my embrace, only my warmth and gentle hug is able to bring out the best in you and your work. Madam, your body can't live without mine, and my body can't live without yours either. I only hope to hasten the day when you and I become one. When Yoshiko's husband came home, he was surprised and angered to see that his wife was in the living room writing her novels. They agreed that she would write her novels in the study room when he wasn't around. Yoshiko's husband was now finding his wife's behavior unbearable, using a chair for her incompetence. If she can't write any stories, then she shouldn't be writing at all, instead of blaming a chair. And even though her husband's words were stern, harsh, a bit cruel, Yoshiko couldn't help but feel that the fear of a man living in a chair right in their study room may be nothing more than a fable. Maybe the strange letters were someone's idea of a sick joke, that the loud noises she heard 3 nights ago were from a thief, that all this was just her imagination getting the better of her. Maybe because her writing hadn't improved, struggling, stressed, so much going on, and the last thing she wanted was to experience the feeling of losing her husband. But when Yoshiko followed her husband to the study room, sitting in the armchair, very still, oblivious to his wife and her pleas for forgiveness, that was when her husband had fell from the chair. For a brief second, Yoshiko was confused as to why her husband had collapsed on the floor. Then she noticed the blood, and just as Yoshiko had given the chair a small glance, that was when she saw it. Her fears, the nightmare, it was real. The human chair was real. Oh yes, the violent murder of the Minister of Foreign Affairs was indeed the kind of shocking news that had made headlines. At first some thought it was an assassination, but upon further investigation it became recognized as one of the most bizarre and disturbing of cases. For quite some time, an unknown man had been living inside the armchair within the Togawa-san's home. Judging by the interior design of the armchair, the small compartments that had rations, stolen items, and even the murder weapon itself, at first it was strongly believed that this unknown man had been residing within the chair before Togawa-san had bought it at the local marketplace. And even though the authorities did believe that Yoshiko's husband was murdered by a man who was living in the armchair, the public, however, had a different opinion as to how Togawa-san died. Rather than believing in things like a human chair, what they believed that it was Yoshiko who was responsible for her husband's death. Well, that was when Yoshiko's career as a writer had begun to falter and fell. She had even become mentally unhinged. In the end, Yoshiko had disappeared, and no one have seen or heard from her again. It's amazing how a chair can play such a role within the story, but of course, this isn't the same chair within Yoshiko's story. That chair was taken by the authorities, and till this day nobody knows the location of that chair. However, this chair does play an important role within the story. You see, when Yoshiko had disappeared, she had never forgotten the moments of relaxation when she had sat upon that chair, where her mind would be free. The feelings of intimacy. So she found that man, and would you believe that he had finally gotten her? Enjoying the rest of their lives together, achieving happiness. What incredible love. Of course, they did have children for the future, as this chair would be passed down by generations, kept by their descendants. Would you believe that this young craftsman is a descendant? That this young woman, customer, who's a female author, he knows her name, and he's a great fan of her work, an admirer. And he knows that lately she's been having trouble with her work, and he could help her. All he has to do is just make a chair, and all her problems would just wash away. The offer had not only chased the beautiful woman out the store, but had given her a grim curiosity that would remain in the back ends of her mind. She just had to know if the story of Tagawa Yoshiko was in fact true. And not only was there existing records of Yoshiko in the murder of her husband, but there were records of the human chair. It was real. All of it. I guess after their grim experience with the human chair, our young and beautiful writer had been weighed down by an unbearable amount of stress. For some reason, she couldn't write any more novels. Tired from avoiding her editor for so many times, well, my friends, I think our writer is about to be given a cure for all her problems. A surprise delivery especially for her. It was a chair, specifically made for her. My friends, I'd hope you enjoyed this wonderful and disturbing tale. And I would like to thank our special guest from Gotham Rogues for his participation with today's story. So please, by all means, give his channel a visit as he spoils you with the long, obscured, and unique history of Batman villains. Please feel free for any questions, comments, or any film corrections until next episode. Thank you for watching the show.